You know, we often look at the glitz and glamour of Hollywood in the 1960s and think of it as a golden era. We see the bright lights, the big hair, and those wide, sun-kissed smiles. But if you pull back the velvet curtain just a little bit, you'll find a much darker story. A story about the price a young girl had to pay just to keep her soul intact. Before Goldie Hawn became the legendary funny girl we all know and love, she was just a 19-year-old dancer with a heart full of dreams and a very thin leotard in her dance bag. But 1964 wasn't a year for dreams. For many young women, it was a year of survival. And it all started with a knock on a door that didn't lead to a movie studio but to a private house in California. Imagine being 19. You're nervous, you're excited, and you've been told that a very powerful man, Al Simon, a big-shot producer, wants to see you. He's the man behind some of the biggest shows on television. In those days, a word from a man like him could turn a nobody into a star overnight. So when he asked her to come to a private casting, she didn't think twice. She put on her leotard, the one she used for rehearsals, and walked into what she thought was her big break. But the moment the door clicked shut behind her, the air in that house changed. It wasn't a studio. There were no cameras, no scripts, no other actors. It was just a quiet, overly decorated room and a man who looked at her like she was a piece of furniture he was thinking about buying. Al Simon didn't start by asking her to read lines. He started by dissecting her dignity. He sat back comfortable in his power and began to talk. But he wasn't talking about her talent or her dance moves. He started talking about readiness. He started talking about the trade-offs it takes to get to the top. You can almost feel the coldness in that room, can't you? Goldie stood there in that thin leotard, a garment designed for movement and art, and suddenly it felt like she was standing there naked. She realized that Al Simon wasn't looking for an actress. He was conducting what I call a dignity autopsy. He wanted to see exactly how much of herself she was willing to cut away to get a job. As he spoke, the atmosphere became thick, almost hard to breathe in. He began to suggest things, actions that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with submission. He was testing her limits, pushing her to see if she would break, if she would say yes, just to please the man who held the keys to the city. In her memoir, Goldie looks back at that 19-year-old girl and remembers the exact moment her heart began to race. "I stood there in that thin leotard," she said. "He started talking about the trade. I felt the air in the room freeze. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That choice, a choice no child should have to make. On one side, the career you've worked your whole life for. On the other, the person you see in the mirror every morning." But Goldie wasn't like the others. She didn't stay quiet. She didn't play along. She looked at this man, this giant of the industry, and she said no. She chose herself. And that's when the mask of the sophisticated producer dropped. When a man like Al Simon is told no by someone he considers a nobody, his ego doesn't just bruise, it explodes. The anger that came out of him was something Goldie had never seen before. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a sentence. He looked her straight in the eye, his face twisted with the fury of a king whose subject had just rebelled, and he told her, "I will never give you a job in this town. I will make sure you never work in this city again." Can you imagine the weight of those words on a 19-year-old in 1964? That wasn't just a threat. It was a professional death warrant. He was telling her that her dream was over before it even started, all because she wouldn't let him own her. She didn't stay to argue. She didn't wait for him to open the door. She turned and ran. She ran out of that house, away from the shadow of Al Simon and out into the California sun. But even though she was in the bright light, that shadow followed her. It stayed with her for 50 years. She later said that he didn't see her as a human being or an artist. "He looked at me like a commodity to be bargained for," she remembered. It wasn't an audition. It was a seizure of power. He wasn't used to being rejected, especially not by a girl he thought he could easily consume. This was the first fracture in Goldie Hawn's life. It was the moment she realized that the world of Hollywood wasn't built on talent. It was built on a system of private castings and toxic power plays. The media back then would never tell you this. They wanted you to believe in the fairy tale, the Cinderella story of a girl being discovered at a soda fountain. They didn't want to talk about the producers who acted like predators in the dark. That night in 1964 changed everything for Goldie. It was the end of her innocence. She walked into that house as a girl who believed the world was fair, and she walked out as a woman who knew she had to build a fortress around herself. We often wonder why some stars act the way they do, why they create personas or play the dumb blonde. But when you know what happened in that quiet house in California, you start to see things differently. You realize that sometimes the funny girl isn't just trying to make you laugh. Sometimes she's just trying to make sure no one ever looks at her that way again. As we look at her legacy, we have to ask ourselves how many other Goldies were in those rooms. How many other dreams were snuffed out because they couldn't or wouldn't pay the price? Goldie survived, but she carried the shadow of that evening for half a century. It's a reminder that behind every bright star, there's often a story of a girl who had to fight like hell just to keep the light in her eyes. She refused to be a specimen for Al Simon's dominance, and in doing so, she created a tiny crack in the rules of the industry. It wouldn't be the last time she had to fight, but it was the moment she decided that if she was going to make it, she was going to do it on her own terms, even if she had to wear a mask to do it. But you see, running out of that house wasn't the end of the movie. In many ways for Goldie, it was the start of a much longer, much quieter nightmare. You might think that once she escaped the lion's den, the sun would just come up and everything would be fine. But in the Hollywood of 1965, the walls had ears and the doors didn't just close, they were bolted shut from the outside. The next morning, Goldie probably woke up feeling a strange mix of relief and terror. She had kept her soul, yes, but she quickly found out that in that town, keeping your soul often meant losing your seat at the table. Al Simon hadn't just made an empty threat when he told her she'd never work again. He was a man of his word, but only when it came to being cruel. Imagine the routine of a young actress back then. You wake up, you check your mail, and you wait for the phone to ring. Your agent at the William Morris Agency, one of the biggest in the world, is supposed to be your champion. But suddenly the phone went bone dry. Goldie would walk into those sleek casting offices on Sunset Boulevard wearing her best smile, her head held high despite the knot in her stomach. She'd see the secretaries look up, then look down quickly. She'd hear the whispers. "Oh, Goldie. No, we don't have anything for her today, or tomorrow, or next month." She was being erased. It's what the industry calls a blacklist protocol. But for a 19-year-old girl, it just felt like being a ghost. She was walking through a city of dreams, but she had become invisible. Al Simon had reached out through his network of golf buddies and power lunches, and with a few whispers, he had turned her name into poison. Behind the scenes in those leather-bound ledgers where casting directors kept their notes, a specific label started appearing next to Goldie Hawn's name, difficult to work with. Now we know what that really meant. It didn't mean she was late or that she didn't know her lines. It meant she was a woman who said no. It meant she wouldn't play the game. In that toxic ecosystem, if they couldn't own you, they decided you didn't exist. It was a form of economic siege. They weren't just trying to hurt her feelings. They were trying to starve her out. And it almost worked. The months began to stack up like unpaid bills on a kitchen table. 1 month turned into 6. 6 months turned into a year. Imagine the courage it takes to keep your chin up when you've had 12 months without a single paycheck from a major studio. Goldie wasn't living in a mansion. She was in a small apartment where the walls felt like they were closing in. Then came the notices. Not casting notices, but eviction notices. 1, 2, 3. Can you picture her sitting there looking at a bank account that says $0? The same girl who refused to trade her dignity was now wondering if she'd have a roof over her head the following week. The big studios, the ones who had praised her sparkle just weeks before, wouldn't even give her a walk-on role. But this is where you see the real mettle of a person. Goldie didn't pack her bags and go home to Maryland in defeat. She didn't call Al Simon and apologize. Instead, she did something that many would consider a step down, but for her, it was a lifeline. She packed a small suitcase and headed for the neon lights of Las Vegas. If Hollywood didn't want her, she'd find a stage where they didn't care about difficult reputations. She became a dancer in the chorus lines of Vegas. It wasn't the silver screen. It was loud, it was gritty, and it was exhausting. She was a go-go dancer in fringe and sequins, performing for tourists and gamblers in clubs that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap gin. While the gossip magazines were busy writing about the new it girls who had played by the rules, Goldie was sweating under hot stage lights in Nevada just to make enough money to send back for her rent in LA. She was overqualified and under-recognized, a girl with the talent of a lead actress trapped in the body of a background dancer. Every night as she did her routines, she wasn't just dancing. She was survival personified. She was learning that the blacklist could take her roles, it could take her reputation, and it could take her money. It couldn't take her ability to work. She stayed in the shadows of the industry for that entire year of 1965. In the eyes of Hollywood, she was a failure, a has-been before she had even been. To the casting directors, she was a cautionary tale. See what happens when you don't cooperate. But as she stood on those Vegas stages, something was changing inside her. She was watching the world from the sidelines, seeing how the machinery of fame really worked. She realized that the system was designed to break you, and if you weren't going to break, you had to learn how to bend without snapping. She spent 365 days being a nobody. She watched her bank account hit rock bottom, and she felt the cold sting of being ignored by people who used to call her honey and sweetheart. But you know, there's a funny thing about silence. It gives you a lot of time to think. While Hollywood was busy trying to bury her, Goldie Hawn was busy planting herself. She was learning that if the front door is locked and the man at the desk says you aren't on the list, you don't stand there crying. You find a side door. You find a different stage. You wait. She was 20 years old now, a veteran of a war no one else knew she was fighting. She had survived the blacklist protocol not by changing her mind but by changing her strategy. The price of her refusal had been a year of her life and every penny she owned. It was a heavy price, a price most people would never have the stomach to pay. But as she looked at her reflection in those vanity mirrors in Vegas, she wasn't looking at a victim. She was looking at a survivor who was just getting her second wind. The world thought they had finished her, but Goldie knew something they didn't. You can't keep a light like hers under a bushel forever, not when the person holding the light has already seen the worst the dark has to offer. Once Goldie Hawn put on that mask, that wide-eyed, giggling, dumb blonde persona we talked about, she found a way to breathe. But the tragic thing is, she wasn't the only one suffocating. While she was tucked away in her apartment practicing how to hide her intelligence in the mirror, thousands of other girls were walking down Sunset Boulevard, each carrying their own invisible scars. If Goldie's story was a single fracture, then Hollywood in the 1960s was an earthquake that had broken nearly everyone it touched. When we look back in those old movies, we see the glamour, we see the big studio gates and the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. But we rarely talk about the standard operating procedure that was happening in the shadows. You see, what happened to Goldie wasn't some freak accident or a one-time encounter with a bad apple. It was the design of the machine itself. Think about those talent agencies on Sunset Boulevard. Back then, they were the gatekeepers of the American dream. If you were a young girl from a small town with a bit of talent and a lot of hope, you had to go through them. But these agencies weren't just managing talent. They were managing a market. And in that market, the most valuable currency wasn't acting ability, it was cooperation. The agents, the men in the sharp suits with the cigars and the mahogany desks, knew exactly what they were doing. When they told a 19-year-old girl that she had a private casting at a producer's home at 9:00 p.m., they weren't being careless. They were the ones who set the table. They knew that when that door clicked shut, a transaction was about to take place, one that didn't involve scripts or monologues. The most heartbreaking part of this toxic ecosystem was the silence that was bought and paid for. These agents took their 15% commission not just from the girls' paychecks, but from their silence. If a girl came back crying, if she was bruised or shaken, she wasn't met with comfort. She was met with a cold stare and a reminder that there were 500 other girls waiting in the lobby who wouldn't be so sensitive. It's estimated that nearly 90% of the young women trying to make it in those days faced some version of that casting couch. Think about that number for a second. That means almost every iconic face you saw on the silver screen had likely walked through a fire that the public knew nothing about. And for every Goldie Hawn who managed to turn her trauma into a shield and become a star, there were hundreds of nameless victims girls whose names we never learned because they couldn't endure the price. They just disappeared. They went back to their hometowns, or they slipped into the margins of society carrying a weight that no 19-year-old should ever have to bear. And where was the media in all of this? You'd think the newspapers and the magazines would have been shouting from the rooftops. But no. The gossip columnists of the 60s were the ultimate bodyguards for the powerful. They spent their days building these studio moguls up like they were Greek gods, wise, benevolent creators of art. They painted the casting couch as a spicy Hollywood legend, a bit of a naughty joke rather than what it actually was, a systematic theft of human dignity. There was no HR department to call. There was no Me Too movement on the horizon. There was just a girl, a powerful man, and a system that made sure the girl knew she was replaceable. The private casting wasn't a secret, it was a standard. It was the entry fee. Imagine the atmosphere in those waiting rooms. You'd have 20 girls sitting there, all in their best dresses, all clutching their headshots. They'd look at each other not as colleagues, but as rivals in a game where the rules were rigged against them all. When one girl walked out of the inner office with her makeup smudged and her eyes glazed over, the girl sitting next to her didn't ask if she was okay. She just looked down at her own shoes, swallowed her fear, and waited for her name to be called. The trauma was standardized. It was built into the budget. The studios and the agencies didn't see these women as artists. They saw them as units of production. And if a unit was damaged, if a girl spoke up or fought back, she was simply discarded. There were no settlements, no apologies, and certainly no therapy paid for by the studio. The price for a girl's dignity was $0 in the eyes of the industry. This was the horizontal spread of the poison. It wasn't just one office in one building, it was the entire foundation of the city. The Sunset Boulevard agents knew the producers' preferences. They knew which directors liked to play games. And they sent girls there anyway because that's how the gears kept turning. When Goldie Hawn ran out of that house and eventually decided to become the dumb blonde, She was reacting to a world that had collectively decided that a woman's mind was an obstacle to her success. She saw the 90% who were being crushed, and she realized that to survive she had to navigate a dignity market, where the buyers had all the power and the sellers had to hide who they really were just to keep their lives. We look at those old photos of starlets laughing by the pool, and we see the golden age. But maybe when we look a little closer, we can see the shadows in the corners of those photographs. We can see the cost of the standard industry procedure. It's a story of 1,000 silent rooms and 1,000 locked doors where the only thing being produced wasn't art but a very specific kind of endurance. Goldie Hawn survived it, and she did it with a laugh that became world famous. But she was one of the lucky ones. The rest of that 90%, their stories didn't end with an Oscar or a star on the Walk of Fame. Their stories ended in the quiet realization that in the city of dreams, the most expensive thing you could own was your own soul. And as the sun set over Hollywood in 1965, the machine just kept on humming, waiting for the next busload of 19-year-olds to arrive with their dance bags and their hopes completely unaware of the trade they were about to be asked to make. By 1968, the silence that had followed Goldie Hawn since that dark night in 1964 was finally broken. But it wasn't broken by a scream or a protest. It was broken by a sound that would soon become the most recognizable noise in America, a high-pitched, breathless, and infectious giggle. You might remember the show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. It was a whirlwind of neon colors, fast-paced jokes, and psychedelic dancing. And right in the middle of it was Goldie. She was the it girl, the one who would forget her lines, look at the camera with those massive wide eyes, and just laugh her way out of it. To the millions of people watching at home, she was a breath of fresh air. A girl who didn't take herself too seriously. A dumb blonde who was just happy to be there. But if we look closer at her behavior during those years, we see something much more profound than a simple comedy routine. We see a masterclass in psychological camouflage. You see, the Goldie the public fell in love with wasn't exactly the Goldie who lived inside. The girl who had stood in front of her mirror 4 years earlier, forcing the corners of her mouth up until they ached, had perfected her role. On the set of Laugh-In, she used her body and her voice like a shield. Have you ever noticed how she would tilt her head to the side when a male co-star spoke to her? Or how she would stumble over big words, making herself look confused and harmless? This wasn't an accident. This was a survival strategy that had been polished to a brilliant shine. In the predatory world of 1960s, Hollywood being a smart woman was like walking around with a target on your back. But a dumb blonde was safe. She was non-threatening. To the men in power, the ones who still held the keys to the kingdom. A girl who seemed a bit ditzy was someone they didn't need to dominate. They felt big and strong around her, and because they felt powerful, they didn't feel the need to be cruel. Every time Goldie messed up a line on purpose and let out that signature giggle, she was sending a silent signal to the industry. I'm just a silly girl. You don't need to worry about me. I'm not here to challenge your authority. It's a fascinating bit of human behavior, isn't it? She used the very stereotypes that were meant to keep women down and turned them into a suit of armor. While the industry thought they were discovering a natural talent for comedy, Goldie was actually performing a sophisticated act of identity erasure. She buried the girl who had been terrified by Al Simon and Al Cap so deep that no one could ever find her again. And boy, did the industry love it. They didn't just give her a job, they turned her into a multi-million-dollar brand. The dumb blonde wasn't just a character anymore, it was an asset. Advertisers, movie studios, and network executives realized that audiences found her helplessness charming. Her image was worth millions of dollars because it made people feel good without making them think too hard. But imagine for a second what it's like to live inside that mask. Imagine being a sharp, observant, and deeply sensitive woman who has to spend 8 hours a day pretending she doesn't know what's going on. Imagine the mental toll of having to suppress your own intelligence just to ensure your safety and your paycheck. Behind the bright lights of the Laugh-In stage, the behavior was different. When the cameras stopped rolling, the giggle would vanish. Those who worked closely with her started to see glimpses of the real Goldie, a woman who was meticulous about her craft, who understood exactly how the lenses worked, and who was keeping a very close eye on her contracts. But to the world, and especially to the gatekeepers of the industry, she never let the mask slip. She had learned that in Hollywood, your market value was often tied to how much of your true self you were willing to hide. The public didn't want a woman who remembered the sound of a locking door. They wanted the girl who tripped over her own feet and laughed about it. So she gave them exactly what they wanted. She became the ultimate innocent. By 1969, she had won an Academy Award for Cactus Flower. Think about the irony of that. She won the highest honor in acting for playing a character that wasn't all that different from the mask she wore every day to stay safe. As she stood on that stage clutching the gold statue, she was the most famous woman in the world. But even then, if you look at the footage, she's still playing the part wide eyes, breathless voice, the "I can't believe this is happening to me" shrug. It was a perfect loop. The mask had protected her, the mask had made her rich, and now the mask had made her a serious actress. But the cost was hidden in the fine print. Behind that $10 million brand was a human being who had to perform an autopsy on her own dignity every single day just to keep the predators at bay. She once reflected that she practiced being that dumb blonde until it felt like her own skin. It's a chilling phrase, isn't it? To have a mask become your skin. It means you can't just take it off when you go home. The giggle becomes a reflex. The clumsiness becomes a habit. The girl who sat on the floor in the dark in 1964 was still there, but she was buried under layers of sequins, awards, and the roar of public approval. When we watch those old clips now, we see a woman who looks like she hasn't a care in the world. But if we look through the lens of what she had endured, we see a survivor who was hiding in plain sight. She wasn't lucky to be talented. She was brilliant enough to know that in a world of wolves, the only way to lead the pack is to convince them you're just a harmless butterfly. It makes you think about the price of success and the disguises we all put on to navigate the world. Goldie Hawn's laughter wasn't just comedy, it was a fortress. And while the world was busy laughing at the silly girl on the television, she was busy building an empire that no one could ever take away from her again. She had survived the private auditions and the blacklists by becoming someone that Al Simon would never even recognize. She had won, but she had to lose herself to do it. So that mask, the one she spent hours perfecting in front of her mirror in the dark, didn't just save her life. It did something even more complicated. It made her a fortune. But you see, here is the strange, heavy irony of Goldie Hawn's story. Once that dumb blonde persona became a global brand worth millions, Goldie herself became a prisoner of her own success. By the time the 1970s and 80s rolled around, Goldie wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a walking, talking corporation. We're talking about a woman who could command $20 million per movie. She was the golden girl of Hollywood. Every time she stepped in front of a camera, she brought a sense of sunshine, laughter, and uncomplicated joy to the world. But behind the scenes, that sunshine was being guarded by a small army of lawyers, publicists, and studio executives. You see in the eyes of the bigwigs in the studio boardrooms, Goldie's innocence wasn't just a character trait, it was a primary asset. And like any asset, it had to be protected at all costs. Imagine for a second being in her shoes during those peak years. You're at the top of the mountain. You have the fame, the money, and the love of millions. But you're also carrying that 1964 secret in your pocket like a piece of broken glass. If she had come out and told the truth back then, if she had described the private casting with Al Simon or the trauma of the blacklisting year, the Golden Girl image would have shattered. Back in those days, the public didn't have a vocabulary for trauma or survivorship. They would have seen her as damaged goods. They would have stopped seeing the bubbly girl and started seeing a victim. And for the studios, that would have been a financial catastrophe. They had hundreds of millions of dollars riding on the idea that Goldie Hawn was the happiest woman on earth. So a protective belt was built around her. It was a sophisticated system of PR and legal silence. The industry that had once tried to destroy her for saying no was now the same industry that was keeping her secret not to protect her, but to protect their investment. It was a very quiet, very polite form of ransom. They gave her the world, but in return she had to keep wearing the mask even when it felt like it was suffocating her. This is where the economics of silence gets really interesting. Her behavior during these decades was a masterclass in professional discipline. She never slipped. She never showed the cracks. In interviews, she was always on, that high, breathy voice, the infectious laugh, the stories about being a bit of a klutz. She was fulfilling her end of a bargain she never officially signed. Think about the mental energy that takes to be the light for an entire world while your own history is buried in the dark. Every time she walked onto a talk show set, she knew that her value was tied to her unbreakability. If she showed a hint of the steel or the sadness underneath, the stock price of Goldie Hawn Inc. would drop. The advertisers and the global brands loved her because she was safe. She was the girl you'd want to have a picnic with. She was the girl who made everything feel like it was going to be okay. But that safety was a product. She had become a sample of human happiness that was sold to the masses, and the forensic evidence of her past was scrubbed clean by the very people who benefited from her fame. During those 2 decades at the top of the box office, Goldie was the queen of Hollywood. But in many ways, she was still that 19-year-old girl in the leotard standing in a room where the door was locked. Only this time, the room was a mansion and the lock was a $20 million paycheck. She was caught in a golden trap. If she told the truth, she'd lose the empire she had worked so hard to build. If she kept the secret, she had to live a life of performance even when the cameras were off. It was a tax on her soul that no one ever saw on a balance sheet. You have to wonder, sitting there in her quiet moments, did she ever look at the Goldie on the screen and feel like she was looking at a stranger? She had become so good at being Goldie that the real woman, the one who was smart, sharp, and resilient, had to live in the shadows of her own spotlight. The studios and the agents didn't want the real Goldie. They wanted the dumb blonde because dumb doesn't ask questions and dumb doesn't demand justice for things that happened 20 years ago. They turned her survival tactic into a commodity, and she had to watch as her own pain was recycled into wholesome entertainment. As she moved through the 80s, her power grew, but so did the complexity of the lie. She started producing her own films, taking control of her career in a way few women had done before. But even as a producer, she knew she had to keep the Goldie brand intact. She was a savvy businesswoman playing a silly girl so that she could stay in the room and keep the lights on. It's a story of incredible strength, but also of a very lonely kind of silence. She was the most successful woman in town, and yet she was the only one who knew that her entire empire was built on a foundation of hidden fractures. We look at those years as the peak of her life. But when you understand the pricing of that smile, you realize that every giggle on screen was a payment toward a debt she shouldn't have owed in the first place. She paid for her success twice, once with her trauma, and a second time with the silence she had to maintain to keep that success alive. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who make us laugh the loudest are the ones who are carrying the heaviest secrets. And the Golden Girl of Hollywood was perhaps the most brilliant accountant of all. She knew exactly what her silence was worth, and she was willing to pay it one perfect giggling take at a time until the world was finally ready to hear the truth. While Goldie was busy keeping her end of that silent bargain, the one where she traded her true self for a seat at the table, the man who had first tried to break her didn't just fade away into the shadows. No, Al Simon did the exact opposite. He stepped right into the brightest spotlight of all. It's a funny thing how history works, isn't it? Especially in a place like Hollywood. While Goldie was spending her days in the 70s and 80s carefully managing a mask of bubbly innocence, Al Simon was busy directing a different kind of performance, the cleanup of his own life story. Imagine being Al Simon during those years. You've become a legend. You're one of the fathers of modern television production. When you walk into a room, people don't see a man who cornered a 19-year-old girl in a private house and told her she'd never work again. They see a titan. They see a visionary. They see a man with a shelf full of Lifetime Achievement Awards. This was the whitewashing campaign of the century, and it was carried out with the kind of clinical precision you'd expect from a high-powered production company. You won't find a single police report with his name on it from 1964. You won't find a single scandal article in the trade magazines. Why? Because Al Simon owned the ink. He owned the airwaves. He was the man who kept the lights on for the entire industry. He used his money and his immense power to buy something much more valuable than a mansion or a fancy car. He bought a clean immortality. But you have to look at the behavior behind that legacy. While Al Simon was being honored at black tie galas, shaking hands with presidents, and being called a pioneer of the arts, Goldie Hawn was doing a very different kind of work. She was in the quiet, dim light of a therapist's office, sitting on a different kind of couch, one where she was trying to piece back together the woman she had been before that night in 1964. Isn't that the real tragedy of this whole system? The injustice isn't just in what happened in that room, it's in what happened afterward. For decades, Goldie had to be her own cleanup crew. Every time she stepped onto a movie set and felt that old familiar tightening in her chest, that instinct to giggle and act small just to stay safe, she was paying for Al Simon's crimes. She was the one who had to foot the bill for 30 years of therapy. She was the one who had to do the hard, grueling mental labor of processing the trauma. Meanwhile, Al Simon didn't spend a single cent on his own conscience. He didn't have to heal, because in his mind and in the eyes of the world, he had never done anything wrong. The system was designed to protect him, to make sure his contributions to television far outweighed the little incidents that happened behind closed doors. He was a gatekeeper who had successfully burned the gate down behind him once he was safely inside. Think about the long list of awards he received. Every trophy was like a layer of fresh white paint over a crumbling wall. Lifetime Achievement. Visionary Producer. These titles weren't just honors. They were erasers. They were meant to tell anyone who might have a story to tell. Look at this man. He is too important to be a villain. He is too successful to be a predator. And for a long time it worked. The media, the same media that would have torn a young actress apart for being difficult, treated Al Simon with a kind of religious reverence. His production companies were machines that turned silence into gold. They knew how to handle problematic memories. They knew that if you repeat a lie or keep a silence for long enough, it becomes the truth. When Al Simon finally passed away, he died as a hero of the industry. His obituaries were glowing. They talked about his sharp eye for talent and his unrivaled influence on the medium. There was no mention of the 19-year-old girl in the leotard who had to run for her life. There was no mention of the year she spent as an invisible person because he had whispered the wrong words into the right ears. The cleanup was complete. But as the world celebrated, the legend of Al Simon, Goldie Hawn was still there, carrying the scars into every scene she filmed. She carried that 1964 secret through Private Benjamin, through Overboard, and into her later years. It was a weight that never really left her, even when she became a mogul herself. The most bitter part of it all is the cost of living. In the forensic ledger of Hollywood history, Al Simon's debt was set to zero. He didn't have to face a single lawsuit. He didn't have to answer a single difficult question. He lived a life of luxury and died with a spotless name. Goldie, on the other hand, had to pay for her own survival. She paid for it with the years she spent pretending to be someone else. She paid for it with the money she spent on healers and therapists to help her untangle the dumb blonde mask from her own skin. It makes you think about what we choose to remember and what we're told to forget. We see the Lifetime Achievement Awards and we think we're seeing a life well lived. But maybe the real story is found in the people who weren't on the stage that night. The ones who were sitting in a quiet room somewhere else just trying to feel safe in their own bodies. History might have let Al Simon off the hook, but the record is still there, hidden in the behavior of a woman who had to laugh her way through a 50-year trauma. The silence that Al Simon bought with his power was expensive, but as we look at Goldie's long road to healing, we start to see who really paid the price. In the end, Al Simon left behind a legacy of clean credits and shiny statues. Goldie Hawn left behind something much more difficult and much more real. The story of a girl who refused to stay broken even when the man who broke her was being crowned king. And maybe that's the most important detail of all that. While he was busy cleaning up his past, she was busy reclaiming her future, one hard-earned smile at a time. Al Simon might have passed away with his clean legacy intact, buried under layers of white paint and shiny Lifetime Achievement Awards. But here's the thing about paint. If the wood underneath is rotting, eventually, it starts to peel. For over 50 years, the story of what happened in that California house in 1964 stayed locked inside Goldie Hawn. It was a secret she carried through every Oscar win, every red carpet premiere, and every million-dollar deal. But then, around 2017, the world started to tilt on its axis. You remember how it felt back then, don't you? It was like a dam finally breaking. Suddenly, the silence that had been the industry standard for decades wasn't enough to hold back the tide anymore. The #MeToo movement wasn't just a hashtag. For women like Goldie, it was the first time in half a century that the air felt safe enough to breathe without a mask. When Goldie finally stepped into what I call the courthouse of truth, she didn't do it with the breathy giggle or the wide-eyed, dumb blonde persona that had made her a fortune. Between 2017 and 2024, as she began to share the specific details of her encounter with Al Simon, her behavior was different. Her voice was steady. Her eyes weren't vacant. They were sharp, clear, and filled with the weight of 50 years of waiting. She finally said his name, Al Simon. It wasn't a piece of juicy gossip for the tabloids. When she spoke, it felt more like she was delivering a forensic report on a crime scene that had been cold for 5 decades. She described the room, the leotard, and the way the air seemed to freeze when he started talking about the trade. She spoke for the 19-year-old girl who had been too terrified to call the police, and she did it with the authority of a woman who had outlived her predator and outgrown her fear. Now, a lot of people, especially the younger generation, might look at her and ask, Goldie, why did you wait so long? Why didn't you say something in the 70s or the 80s? But you and I know the answer to that, don't we? It wasn't because she was weak or scared. It was a cold, hard calculation of survival. In 1964, speaking out would have ended her life. In 1985, at the height of her fame, telling the truth would have been bad for the brand. The studios would have called her unstable. The public would have seen her as tainted. And that $20 million per movie empire would have vanished overnight. She had to wait until she was untouchable. She had to wait until she had enough power, enough money, and enough distance from the machine so that the truth wouldn't crush her. Her silence for 50 years wasn't a sign of defeat. It was the ultimate strategic retreat. She played the game by their rules for half a century just so she could be the one to write the final chapter. When she finally spoke, she pulled back the curtain on that golden age we all talk about. She showed us that the red carpets weren't just for walking on. They were used to cover up the rot. Every private casting and every blacklist was a brick in a wall that was built to keep women in their place. Her testimony wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire ecosystem that relied on the silence of 19-year-old girls to keep its gears turning. Imagine the relief of finally setting that burden down. For 50 years, she had to act like that night didn't happen. She had to smile at the same people who knew exactly what men like Al Simon were doing. She had to be the golden girl while carrying a leaden secret. But as she spoke out in those recent years, you could see a change in her. The innocent was gone, replaced by the survivor. She didn't need the dumb blonde mask anymore. She proved that you can spend decades hiding in plain sight, and you can even let the world believe you're silly or clumsy, as long as you never forget who you really are. The millions she made and the awards she won were no longer the only things that defined her legacy. Now her legacy was her truth. She proved that the standard industry procedure of the 1960s was a failure because it couldn't break her. It could take her year of income, it could take her reputation for a while, and it could force her into a mask, but it couldn't take her memory. As we watch Goldie Hawn today, there's a different kind of light in her eyes. It's not the bright, flickering neon of the laugh-in stage. It's a steady, quiet glow. She is a woman who outlasted the system that tried to own her. She watched the gatekeepers like Al Simon get their Lifetime Achievement Awards, and then she watched as the world finally realized what those awards were actually hiding. There was no lawsuit filed in the end. There were no handcuffs. Al Simon was already gone. But in the court of history, the verdict was clear. Goldie Hawn didn't just survive, she won. She showed us that the most powerful thing you can do in a world that wants to consume you is to stay alive, keep your head down when you have to, and wait for the day when your voice is finally louder than their silence. The dumb blonde is gone now. In her place is a woman who remembers every detail, every lock of a door, and every whispered threat. And as she tells her story to a new generation of girls who are walking onto their own movie sets, she isn't just a movie star. She's a mapmaker, showing them where the traps are hidden and reminding them that no matter how much the industry tries to price your soul, you're the only one who gets to decide if it's for sale. The giggle was a shield, the mask was a fortress, and the silence was a strategy. But the truth is the only thing that finally let Goldie Hawn come home to herself. And that more than any Oscar or box office record is the real story of the girl who was too smart to let them know how much she knew. As the truth started spilling out into the light in these later years, it began to explain something that used to puzzle a lot of people in Hollywood. For a long time, the gossip columns and the industry insiders had a bit of a nickname for Goldie Hawn. They called her a helicopter mother. They'd whisper at parties about how she was always there, always hovering, always checking the fine print of her daughter Kate's schedule. Back in the year 2000, when Kate Hudson was first breaking through and Almost Famous people thought Goldie was just being overbearing, they saw a famous mother who couldn't let go. But if you look at it through the lens of what happened in 1964, you realize that Goldie wasn't just being a mom, she was running a sophisticated security protocol. Think about the world Kate was entering. It was still the era of Harvey Weinstein and men who used their office doors like traps. But Kate Hudson didn't enter that world the way Goldie had. She didn't enter as a 19-year-old girl in a leotard with nothing but a dance bag and a dream. She entered as the daughter of a fortress. Goldie and her longtime partner Kurt Russell had spent decades building what I like to call a steel shield around their family. By the time Kate started auditioning, the Hawn Hudson family wasn't just a group of actors. They were an empire worth over $100 million. And that money wasn't just for luxury. It was for independence. It meant that Kate never needed a job badly enough to have to trade anything for it. The behavior inside that family was fascinating. There was a set of unwritten rules that every casting director in Hollywood eventually learned. If you wanted to meet with Kate Hudson, you didn't do it at a private house. You didn't do it after 6:00 p.m. You did it in a bright public studio office or a corporate building during business hours. And if anyone even suggested a private casting or an informal meeting at a hotel, the Hawn Hudson machine would shut them down instantly. There's a famous bit of industry lore about the notes casting directors would keep. It was basically a warning. Kate Hudson never goes anywhere alone. Her mother holds a list of people who are not allowed to even be in the same room as her. Goldie had spent 50 years watching who was a predator and who was a protector. She had a death diary in her mind of every man like Al Simon, and she used that knowledge to build a wall that no one could climb. The industry used to mock this. They called it nepotism and said Kate was just riding on her mother's coattails. But the truth was much more powerful. Goldie was using her fame as a weapon of defense. She knew that if a producer even thought about trying something with Kate, they weren't just dealing with a young actress. They were dealing with a woman who knew exactly how the industry buried its secrets. As Kate herself once said, "My mother didn't just teach me how to act, she taught me how to smell a predator from a mile away." Goldie had turned her own trauma into a specialized radar for her children. Imagine the difference in their stories. In 1964, Goldie ran out of a dark house in tears, fearing her career was over because she said no. In 2000, Kate Hudson walked onto movie sets with the confidence of someone who knew her family had her back no matter what. That's a powerful kind of revenge, isn't it? To make sure the next generation never even has to hear the sound of a door locking? Kurt Russell once put it perfectly when he said, "They call us a power family, but the truth is we're just a family on guard." They weren't interested in being Hollywood royalty. They were interested in being a phalanx. For the last 25 years, while other young actresses were navigating the dangerous waters of the Weinstein era, Kate Hudson was safe. She was safe because Goldie Hawn had spent every day since 1964 making sure she would be. Goldie took the innocent mask she had worn for so long and she forged it into a shield. She used the power she gained from playing the dumb blonde to become the smartest protector in the business. When you look at the Hawn-Hudson family today, you see a dynasty that is thriving. They are wealthy, they are respected, and most importantly, they are whole. The empire of Al Simon has long since crumbled into the dust of history, remembered only for its cruelty. But Goldie's bloodline is still dominating the screen, and they're doing it on their own terms. The final victory for Goldie Hawn wasn't found in a courtroom or in an Oscar trophy. It was found in a simple, quiet reality, seeing her daughter walk through the halls of Hollywood without ever having to look over her shoulder. She turned the humiliation of a 19-year-old girl into the ultimate power, the power to say no for her children when she couldn't say it for herself. And in doing so, she proved that while a predator might be able to steal a girl's innocence, they can never steal a mother's resolve to make sure it never happens again. As we look at her life now, we don't just see a funny girl who made us laugh. We see a woman who stood in the dark, vown at her dress and trembling, and decided right then and there that she would build a world where that dress would never be crushed again. She played the game, she wore the mask, and she won the long war. And as the sun sets over her career, the most beautiful thing about it isn't the fame, it's the safety she built for everyone she loves. She didn't just survive Hollywood, she tamed it. And she did it all with a smile that was always a lot smarter than the world ever gave it credit for, ever gave it credit for, ever gave it credit for, ever gave it credit